Hey there everyone, That Sexy Nerd is back again, and I went ahead and I did the Benedict Arnold as my return to extra history, but as you guys know, they pointed it out in the other video that they had already started with the invasion of Quebec, and I never even heard of that. I thought like the United States was involved with Canada during the War of 1812. So, yeah, I would love to go through all this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this all in just one video and do the Benedict Arnold ones separately. So I'll put this out first, and then Benedict Arnold will come second. So since I know basically nothing about this, why don't we just get into the video? And remember, please smash that like button if you want to see more sexy and nerdy content, and subscribe if you think I deserve it. And remember, check out my Patreon for new reactions to all full-length reactions to all my latest videos. And remember, I'm doing all of them in this one video. So let's do this thing, y'all.
May 10th, 1775, Fort Ticonderoga, New York. The Star Fort has a commanding presence over Lake Champlain. Its sloped walls have been engineered to deflect cannonballs and allow infantry to fire down at any attackers. 17 years before, its garrison had sallied out and repelled an army 16,000 strong. But tonight, there are only 48 British soldiers and 1 sentry on guard duty when the rebels storm in. The sentry sees the attack coming and levels his musket at an approaching officer, but the gun misfires and the man slaps him down with the flat of his sword. Storming the fort tonight feels less like a military operation and more like breaking and entering. Rebels rouse sleeping soldiers at gunpoint, and the commanding officer has to put on his pants before he can surrender. Then, when asked by what authority they've entered, the second officer says, "In the name of the great Jehovah and the Continental Congress." These colonial militia have just taken the most significant fort between New York and the colony of Quebec, and soon it will serve as the staging point to invade Canada. One partially led by the same officer who attacked that sentry with his sword, the one and only Benedict Arnold. In 1775, before the Declaration of Independence, before the founding of the Continental Army, and even before the Continental Congress fully decided on rebellion, America invaded Canada. And it was an operation that was American through and through, filled with its characteristic optimism, entrepreneurial nature, and clashing individualism. It was also the country's first military disaster. Yet, it almost worked. It came close enough that if things had played out a little differently, Quebec might have become the 14th colony. It also serves as the origin story to early America's most infamous figure, Benedict Arnold, a man who would be among the colony's greatest heroes and its greatest traitor. But this tale begins far earlier than the storming of Fort Ticonderoga. In fact, its roots lay in the Seven Years' War. Actually, you know, a lot of the American Revolution has its roots in the 7 Years' War, though in America it goes by its street name, the French and Indian War. Everything from new taxes leveled on the colonies, to the military backgrounds of many British and Continental officers, to the military alliances with indigenous tribes, have some connection to that earlier conflict. But one of the larger legacies of the 7 Years' War was that Britain had wrested New France away from the French Empire, renaming it the province of Quebec. Yet, despite falling under British control, in 1775, the population remained very much French, making it an attractive target for the rebels who thought the Canadians might join the revolution. Oh, and just a quick terminology note, though the official name of the province was Quebec, we're also going to be using the name Canada in this series for a couple of reasons. First, because it gives us a shorthand between the city of Quebec and the province as a whole, and second, because the name Canada was already an informal name at the time, and that's the term that most American revolutionaries used. Anyway, as soon as the American Revolution began, a few of the more aggressive rebels immediately started looking northward to Quebec. Because you see, when the bullets started flying at Lexington and Concord, signaling the start of America's rebellion, the result wasn't a battle, but a siege. British troops retreated to Boston, where the militias penned them in, cutting off their land access so they could only be resupplied by sea past an American blockade. But those militias were not military units. The Continental Army didn't exist yet, and as such, these groups were just competing colonial militias acting under the orders of colonial committees or without orders entirely. And that's what Benedict Arnold was doing when he headed up to Canada. a merchant who had sailing experience and knew the Canadian border from trading there, he rushed northward with the rank of colonel, bestowed by a Connecticut militia, and orders from the Massachusetts Committee of Safety to gather men for a specific mission. His objective: seize the lightly defended Fort Ticonderoga and capture its guns so they could be sent south to the siege of Boston, where the colonial troops were long on patriot zeal, but short of artillery. However, it was a debacle. But sort of a wildly successful debacle. See, when Arnold started raising troops, he also heard that an expedition was already on the way to Ticonderoga. Not wanting to miss the glory, he then rushed ahead to take command, only to find out the unit was not so keen on that idea. For these were the Green Mountain Boys, under Ethan Allen, and, well, they're kind of a whole thing. The Green Mountain Boys hailed from the New Hampshire Grants, a no-man's land of competing land claims between the colonies of New York and New Hampshire. And Allen had founded the Boys 5 years earlier, not to fight the British, but rather to intimidate and expel New Yorkers attempting to enforce land claims. But now they were ostensibly working for the revolutionary cause. But within 2 years, their region would actually declare itself the Vermont Republic, an independent nation that only joined the United States in 1791. So basically, it's important to remember that these rebels aren't Americans yet, and really wouldn't be for some time. Many primarily identified with their colony or local grievances, rather than a unified patriot cause. As a result, the Green Mountain Boys, wary of outsiders, refused to take orders from Arnold. But not to worry, Allen told him, he could still tag along until his own men caught up. It was the start of a bitter rivalry, and one where Arnold would prove himself the better commander. While the boys spent days getting drunk off Fort Ticonderoga's rum, it was Arnold who cataloged and salvaged the cannons. Then, when Arnold's unit arrived with a captured British sloop, he sailed up Lake Champlain to seize another lightly defended fort. Allen and his boys, trying to race him there to get the glory, fell behind in their paddle-driven boats. And when Arnold warned Allen about making a move on yet another fort, since a British force was in the area, Allen ignored him and blundered into a British attack. Despite this infighting, the campaign was a huge success. They had seized the waterways leading south from Montreal, not only cutting off the communication between British forces in Canada and those in Boston, but ensuring rebel colonies could not be attacked from the north, and of course they secured the cannons to drive the British from Boston. The fact was, as disorganized and under-resourced as the rebels were, the British in Canada were even more so. Most of the territory's troops were penned up in Boston, and the colonials had moved fast enough to catch the small garrisons unprepared.
Surprise.
But both Arnold and Allen saw the potential for more, and both began writing to Congress, wrangling for credit, and urging a full-scale invasion of Canada. Yet, for Arnold, the accolades and recognition seemed slow coming in. First, Congress sent orders to abandon Ticonderoga, which he refused. Then, when a Connecticut colonel showed up with papers saying he was now Arnold's commander, he refused to recognize him. Finally, he resigned his commission and went south to find General Washington and push through his plans to command an expedition to Quebec. But instead, he was hauled in front of a committee that grilled him over a request he'd made for Congress to reimburse him. You see, during the Northern Mission, he'd spent 1,000 pounds of his own money feeding the troops, expecting it would be repaid, only to have that request denied because he hadn't kept receipts. In the end, they only paid a portion. This was both humiliating and depressing for Arnold, not the least because he'd learned upon returning that his beloved wife had died while he was away, and that he'd been passed over for the command of the Quebec expedition. Instead, the rich but relatively inexperienced General Philip Schuyler, father of Angelica, Eliza, and Peggy. Sorry. Anyway, that guy got
Hamilton.
So did Arnold get second in command then? Nope. That went to Major General Richard Montgomery. Schuyler's group would attack up the St. Lawrence River and take St. John's, Montreal, and then the port of Quebec. Yet Benedict Arnold had one card left to play, because the new commander of the Continental Army, George Washington, appeared the only one impressed with his exploits. Washington liked Arnold. Unlike the cautious Schuyler, Arnold was aggressive, decisive, and knew the area. It seemed Washington detected Arnold's ambition, though not his simmering anger. The two developed a plan. While the main force would go up the St. Lawrence, Arnold would recruit a force of 1,000 frontiersmen and approach Quebec City from a more difficult route, across the harsh, uncharted, and unsettled wilds of Maine. And it would be treacherous. A feat of endurance and bravery that would forever prove Arnold's ability as a leader of men, one that would surely give him the acclaim, recognition, and promotion he so richly desired.
No.
So commission in hand as a colonel in the Continental Army, Arnold set out to build his team of Rangers that would do the unthinkable. Little did he know, he was recruiting them for September 10th, 1775, near Fort St. John's, Quebec province. The colonial troops leave their boat and advance on the fort in darkness. This is a great adventure. A month ago, they were simply farmers, merchants, and trappers, but now they are the Continental Army and invading another colony to liberate it. And in their zeal, they know they'll win. But currently, they are creeping their way through swampy terrain in pitch blackness, listening for any hint of the enemy. They're on their guard. For days before, a party trying to approach the fort had been ambushed by 100 native warriors. Then suddenly, in the close, cloying darkness, one soldier hears a footfall, followed by whispers. He fires into the black night. His comrades join. Suddenly, gunfire stabs back at them, the returning blast silhouetting the hostiles shooting back. There's too many of them! The Continental soldiers flee back to their boats, running to General Montgomery to tell them of the ambush, and meeting their sister unit telling the same story. Montgomery looks disappointedly from one unit to the other, for it would seem his proud new army has opened its invasion of Canada by shooting at itself. Last episode, we looked at the American invasion of Canada from the colonial perspective, but the British also knew an invasion was on the way, partially because it had already happened 4 times actually. Pretty much whenever there was a conflict in the Americas, British colonists had tried to strike north and capture French Quebec. And Major General Guy Carleton, governor of the province of Quebec, knew history was repeating. A year before the revolution broke out, the First Continental Congress had sent a letter inviting Quebec to join as the 14th colony. Though no one had ever responded, Carleton did worry about the loyalty of the population, who were still largely French and Catholic. In fact, Parliament was so concerned with the loyalty of the Canadians that in 1774, it had passed the Quebec Act, allowing Catholics to practice openly, vote, and hold government positions. Because if the French Canadians greeted the invading rebels as liberators, as the revolutionaries clearly expected, things would go bad fast. But now, there was hope for Carleton. For the Quebec Act had gotten the province's Catholic clergy on his side, plus most of the Quebec colonists just hated the English settlers to their south. So when he called for militia volunteers, it was a real moment of truth. Though that truth was few men came, which left him with only around 900 regular soldiers and a couple hundred militia, thinly spread across the huge territory. Desperate, Carleton appealed to the indigenous tribes, to whom much of the province was given over to ally with him, but the majority of them stayed neutral as well, waiting to see who'd win. Worse, he would have to wait months for reinforcements to replace any casualties. Given those realities, he employed a defensive strategy. He believed any colonial army would come up through Lake Champlain, aiming to take St. John's, Montreal, and then continue up the river systems to Quebec. So, he would fortify St. John's and stop the rebels there. He was proven right when the colonial army showed up outside the defenses on September 16th. Missing one general, though. General Philip Schuyler, the original Continental commander, had fallen so ill that he'd given up leadership to his second, Brigadier General Richard Montgomery, which overall was a good thing for the Continentals, him being far more experienced and capable, but a rather strange move for Montgomery himself. You see, he was a bit of a reluctant rebel. A longtime British Army officer, he'd only settled in the colonies 2 years before, and while he felt the British government had acted poorly, he was still in favor of reconciliation. Indeed, he may have only joined because his new wife's family were rabid patriots themselves. Now here he was, about to besiege a British fort in order to invade and capture another colony. To add to that awkwardness, during his army days, Montgomery had also served under Fort St. John's commanding officer. Still, Montgomery pushed through. He began erecting breastworks, employing small cannons in firing at the walls, though his troops were vastly outgunned, forcing him to move his cannons back while he waited for heavier artillery. At one point, while supervising construction of siege works, a cannonball passed through his coat and blew him off the top of the breastwork, but he got up and continued with his task.
That's funny.
Thankfully, Montgomery had one advantage here, because before getting sick, Schuyler had successfully lobbied the Iroquois Confederacy to stay neutral in the war. At the same time, the British had bungled their own relations with the native tribes, for during the campaign's opening ambush, British troops had refused artillery support, causing their indigenous allies to desert. But they weren't the only ones leaving, for even as Montgomery received his heavy guns, the one-year enlistments of his soldiers were starting to come due. Meaning every day more left to go home and tend their fields, which, let's face it, was better than sitting in a rainy trench getting bombarded from a fort.
I guess
As
so.
weeks passed and his army shrank, Montgomery stared at the bluffs behind St. John's, thinking that if he could just get some cannon up there, he could end this siege. Meanwhile, Benedict Arnold and his troops were entering the uncharted wilderness of Maine, planning to march to Quebec overland. Initially, things went swimmingly. Arnold had no problem recruiting 1,100 men. In fact, he had more than he could take. One volunteer, Aaron Burr, was only allowed to come if he agreed to do so with no official status or military rank. They reached the Kennebec River without issue, but from there, things got dicey. The man they'd contracted to build flat-bottom riverboats had made them 4 feet shorter than requested, 26 feet rather than 30. They had gaps between the planks, leaked horribly, and were made of heavier wood than contracted. Days after leaving the last major settlements, they had to take a week to repair the boats and try to dry out their food and gunpowder, which was already sodden. It was clear at this point that the expedition had been sabotaged. The barrels they used, made by a cooper who supposedly had loyalist sympathies, were not watertight. And it was increasingly clear that the copy of the British military map Arnold was using had been censored for civilian use, a practice at the time to avoid them being used by enemies.
Really?
Landmarks had been altered, names and distances changed, so they kept having to double back, losing them valuable time. By the time they really knew where they were going, they were hungry, tired, getting sick, and going a little mad. You know, very Werner Herzog, Aguirre, Wrath of God kind of stuff. But that was preferable to when the rivers got too low for the boats to pass. Then they had to take the 400-pound crafts out of the river and carry them on their shoulders, often up the sides of rocky cliffs, just like in Werner Herzog's Fitzcarraldo. I'm sensing a theme. At this point, a third of the expedition turned back, believing Arnold would simply die in the wilderness, never reaching Quebec. But, like a disoriented penguin running towards the mountains, Arnold refused to turn around. He kept going, and men died of exhaustion and disease. Once they reached the heights of Maine and began traveling the rapids toward Quebec, their boats smashed on rocks and pulled soldiers under the whitewater. And even those that survived were beginning to starve. They ate rotten rations, and eventually, the officer's dog they kept as a mascot. They even created a soup by boiling leather pouches and belts, and ate their shoes. Just like the short film Werner Herzog Eats His Shoe. That is a deep cut, Rob. Nice job up top.
Wow.
But real talk, do you think we're overestimating the number of people interested in both the Revolutionary War and German auteur Werner Herzog?
I've never seen that or heard of it.
Of course these jokes are landing. Rescue dog style, am I right? Hey-o!
I know Rescue Dog.
We have fun here. When the survivors of the expedition reached the native settlements along the St. Lawrence River, staggering out of the woods, their clothes ragged like the German wild man Caspar Hauser. Sorry, done for real, promise. The witnesses who saw them couldn't believe what they'd accomplished. And honestly, neither could the men of Arnold's expedition. They'd made it. Within days, after eating and reprovisioning, they would be outside Quebec. One soldier wrote home, saying that the men believed that Arnold's feat was equal to no other military maneuver since Hannibal had crossed the Alps. For through those days of hunger and danger, it was his indomitable will that had carried them through. But they were too late. Had they arrived 10 days earlier, Quebec would have been completely undefended. Remember, Governor Carleton had sent nearly everyone to St. John's and Montreal, just in time for Montgomery to finally seize the heights and force surrender. In fact, the governor had escaped Montreal in disguise just an hour before the Continental Army had taken it without a shot. But now, Carleton was dug in at Quebec, and it would require a huge expense in blood to take it, blood that would spatter on the snow. Because as Montgomery and Arnold joined forces, they'd decided to attack under the cover of a blizzard. And Aaron Burr would prove he wasn't. Wind comes down off the sea, bringing heavy flurries that coat the frozen ground. Snow gathers on the barricaded streets, piling so high buildings can only be entered through upper windows. Frost rhymes gun barrels, and both British soldiers and Canadian militia can see their breath fogging in the night and little past that. For this heavy snow obscures their vision, blowing and whirling, passing almost sideways. It barely betrays the silhouettes of soldiers carrying long muskets. The rebels are in Quebec. Of our first fortune for this ad. For Arnold and Montgomery, the time had finally arrived to move in. They'd spent weeks outside Quebec in the freezing cold, penning in the Crown forces amid the worst winter anyone can remember, and both are riding high on victory. Montgomery, despite his reservations in joining the rebellion, has also proved to be an able general. He expertly forced the garrison at St. John's to surrender by taking outer positions, intercepting supplies and reinforcements, and capturing a high point to pour fire down on the fort. Then he'd taken Montreal without firing a shot. Benedict Arnold, for his part, had led his men on a perilous trek across a largely unknown wilderness, succeeding despite sabotaged maps and inadequate boats. Had he arrived a few days earlier, Quebec might have already fallen. But in front of Quebec, the most heavily fortified city in the Americas, their progress stopped. Montgomery had fired at the walls, trying to bait the garrison into sallying out to fight, but Carleton knew that the French had lost Quebec in the 7 Years' War for exactly that reason. He had more men, 1,800 to the Continental force of 1,100, bigger guns, and 8 months of supplies, so he settled in for a siege to wait the rebels out. Next, Montgomery sent increasingly threatening letters, demanding Carleton's surrender, saying that if he didn't, or he tried to destroy supplies, there would be no mercy shown. To his own troops, Montgomery declared that he would either, quote, dine in Quebec or in hell on Christmas Day. The calendar, however, weighed on Montgomery's mind, because on January 1st, most of his troops ended their terms of enlistment and would go home. They were freezing and miserable. Plus, the Canadians were becoming increasingly hostile as the rebels demanded goods and services while paying in worthless paper currency. Meaning, before the new year, they would need to take the city by storm. Quite literally, actually. Because as December wound down, it was clear that a blizzard was brewing. And should it roll in and cut visibility, it would be their best chance of breaching Quebec. A third of the Crown forces were Canadian militia, who Montgomery thought would prove reluctant and unskilled fighters and would run once battle commenced. So Montgomery decided to attack the lower town, outside the city walls. For capturing the warehouses and goods there would put economic pressure on Carleton, already being urged by Quebec's merchants to surrender. He would approach from the south with 300 men, taking the palisade and outbuildings, while Arnold would lead 500 of his March veterans to do the same thing on the northern side. Also, diversionary attacks would pull British defenders to the eastern and western sectors. And at 5 a.m., a rocket rises into the air, signaling the start of the assault. 90 minutes later, Montgomery's men creep into the city. To get there, they've had to negotiate a path 2 feet deep in snow and slide down a cliff with their coats pulled taut like a sled. He finds the town eerily quiet in the falling snow. They reach a wooden palisade, and Montgomery peers over its edge. No one. He starts yanking out poles, making a hole for him and his soldiers. Now, Montgomery might have been a reluctant rebel. He might have even gotten his commission when his father-in-law had submitted his name without his knowledge, but he is a solid, charismatic commander who is leading from the front rank. He urges his men forward through the blinding snow. "Come on, my good soldiers," he says. "Your general calls you to come." There's now a 2-story blockhouse ahead. He draws his sword, ready to storm it. Then, as he approaches to 50 yards, the winds swirl and the snow parts, revealing 4 cannon in the blockhouse's window, pointing straight towards him. The faces of British soldiers float ghostly in the dark behind. Oh no. He opens his mouth to yell, but the blast covers the sound. The grape shot tears into his shoulder, his throat, and with a thick, wet thud, one ball embeds in his brain. Major General Richard Montgomery, leader of the invasion, falls instantly dead. Around him, staining the red snow, are his whole vanguard. A dozen men, including his second-in-command and his sergeant. A colonel, then coming up behind, orders the remaining men to retreat. Meanwhile, on the northern side of the city, Benedict Arnold and his troops creep into the dockside warehouses, approaching the palace gate. In the vanguard are Arnold and his famine-hardened March veterans, armed with rifles, and a gun crew dragging a 6-pounder cannon mounted on a sled to negotiate the deep snow. Behind them are a column of riflemen, militia, and a group of Canadians and native warriors that have joined the attack. They carry scaling ladders. Now, Quebec is a warren of stone buildings with narrow streets, bound in snow, and the Crown forces have erected barricades entirely sealing off major avenues. So, the plan is to blow down the walls with the cannon and then scale the remains. But the closer they can get before being sighted, the better this attack will go. Then suddenly, as they sneak past the palace gate, a volley from the ramparts rips into them. Iron grenades, their fuses hissing, arc down from above, embedding in the deep drifts and blowing up coughs of shrapnel-laced snow. They rush forward to get out from under the fire, abandoning the heavy cannon when it lodges in a snowbank. They still have the ladders, though. Skirting the city, they pass into a narrow street running right against the shoreline, turning the corner to see another heavy barricade, this time more like a wooden wall. The street in front of it is narrow, choked with snowdrifts. Muskets bang behind the barricade. 2 cannons jet smoke, and he can see heads moving. Having lost his cannon, Arnold has no option but a frontal attack. He yells and waves his men on. They rush forward with ladders, while muskets stab and bullets whiz by, ricocheting off the walls and cobblestones. Suddenly, Arnold trips, hot pain in his ankle. Oh, he's been hit. Stung by one of the many bullets bouncing around the lane. He can no longer walk. 2 men grab him, helping him stay upright and move to the rear. He limps away, still calling encouragement to the men he'd led through starvation and wilderness. Captain Morgan takes over, urging the troops onward. He makes the barricade, shoving aside a hesitant rifleman and scaling the ladder, but then a musket goes off point blank, missing him, but scorching his face with the blast and sending him tumbling to the cobblestones. Undeterred, he mounts the ladder once more and hauls himself onto the parapet. Now surrounded by so many enemies, he has to roll under a cannon to avoid being bayoneted. His men follow, taking the barricade and capturing 30 prisoners. As they're herding the new captives, Morgan rushes ahead to the second barricade, knowing that if they make it over that, they're through. It's undefended, utterly empty, the gate open. But when he returns to rally his troops once more, they say they can't go on, for the rear of the column hasn't arrived yet, and their reinforcements that were supposed to cross the river and join them are nowhere to be seen. Besides, now they have prisoners, 3 times their own numbers, so how can they continue the attack? Morgan, frustrated, argues, but it's 30 minutes before the rest of the column arrives, and he can make an attempt on that second barricade. Now, however, they are met by heads moving on the parapet, and a party of Royal Navy sailors led by their officer who come out of the gate to meet them. The naval officer demands Morgan surrender, but instead, Morgan shoots him dead. The Americans yell, surge at the street, shouting that Quebec is theirs. They place more scaling ladders, but then they're pushed away.
He shot
him, driving down on them. Men take to the houses on the street, trying to outflank the barricade, battling room to room with bayonets and point-blank fire, but the attack is eventually repulsed. Morgan orders his men to shelter in buildings and regroup for another attack, but they're too afraid. For anyone stepping into the street at this point is cut to ribbons with a volley. As the hours pass, their ammunition begins to run dry, and they realize that the British soldiers are now behind them. They're trapped, penned into the city they'd meant to capture. Their army's commander is dead, their second-in-command wounded, and a third of their troops trapped inside of the walls. It's a monumental defeat. Yet Arnold, outnumbered 3-1, refuses to retreat. 4 British reinforcements are inbound to Quebec, and their counterattack may doom the revolution. Of course, Benedict Arnold is not having a happy New Year's Day. He lies in a makeshift hospital outside Quebec, pale from blood loss. His invasion is a disaster. 100 Continental troops are dead, and 44 wounded. Montgomery is slain, and 426 Continental soldiers, most of them from his own unit, are now prisoners. Others are scattered, some fallen through the ice while retreating across the river. Fully, half of the army is killed, wounded, or captured. In return, they have inflicted only 20 casualties to the British, 6 of them fatalities, and soon they will sally out to finish them off. The surgeon tells Arnold he must evacuate south. But instead, Arnold orders the wounded to arm themselves and asks for his own sword and pistols. That's right, Zoe. Doesn't look like Arnold's gonna retreat. Dives into Benedict Arnold's inflated out reason right now over there before you can see it anywhere else. Had Governor Carleton sallied out to attack the American camp, the invasion of Quebec would have been over. He had twice Arnold's numbers and was far better supplied with ammunition. Instead, though, unsure of the Continental numbers, and remembering how the French had lost Quebec by sallying out during the French and Indian War, he consolidated, waiting for the bottled-up contingent under Morgan to run out of ammunition and surrender. Morgan was the last to give up his sword, to a French priest rather than a British officer. Though later criticized for his lack of speed, Carleton was perhaps wise not to gamble his position of strength. After all, he had destroyed a rebel assault with only nominal casualties and was waiting for reinforcements from Britain. Logic dictated that the siege could not last now that the rebels were so reduced in numbers, yet last it did. For nearly 6 months.
Really?
Despite smallpox ravaging the American ranks, desertions, expiring enlistments, bitterly cold weather, and the local Canadians growing hostile at still being paid for supplies and services in useless paper currency, Arnold hung on.
How?
With only 600 troops, he still bottled up Quebec. Which, to be clear, was an impressive military feat, given that usually conducting a siege requires 2 attackers for each defender, not the other way around.
Jeez.
A trickle of reinforcements arrived, but the recruitment stymied because few men wanted to go to Canada. Heck, Washington himself was running out of soldiers, with few re-enlisting. Plus, the American officer garrisoning and mismanaging Montreal refused to leave for fear of an uprising. Meanwhile, Carleton also wasn't endearing himself to the local population. While he treated his American prisoners well, like captured soldiers rather than rebels, he ruthlessly pursued any Canadian collaborators. He stripped their militia commissions and seized property, and used old French laws to draft labor from the population. To this, he added religious pressure. The Bishop of Quebec was a staunch ally of his and excommunicated any Canadians who supported the revolutionaries, even in speech. The Americans tried to mollify the restive Canadian population with a diplomatic visit from a commission led by Benjamin Franklin, but truly the central issue was money, and Congress had none to give. Therefore, once the British reinforcements arrived under General John Burgoyne, it was clear the situation was untenable. The Americans retreated, evacuating across the border and into Lake Champlain in June of 1776, with Arnold honoring a promise he'd made to the Army's new field commander. Yes, he'd been passed over again, was the last man to leave Canada. With the Redcoat Army on his heels, Arnold secured a boat, shot his horse to prevent capture, directing his aide to do the same, then pushed the boat off with his own hands. But while the invasion had failed, it was already having repercussions far beyond the borderlands. Arnold's stoicism, it seemed, found admirers in Congress, who commended him and gave him a promotion to brigadier general. Yet his desperate letters also pressed home the necessity of soldiers signing enlistments for longer than 1 year. Because at the beginning, it was thought the war might be short, that it might not really be a war at all. Had they taken Quebec, for example, it was believed that it could be used as a bargaining chip to extract concessions from London, opening a path to reconciliation. Extract concessions from London, opening a path to reconciliation. That wasn't going to happen now, though. For the same day that news of the New Year's Eve defeat at Quebec arrived in Philadelphia, Congress also received word that King George III had made a speech declaring the American revolutionaries traitors and refusing to negotiate. This shut off the possibility of reconciliation right quick, and pushed Congress closer to the previously radical idea of declaring independence from Great Britain. After all, Washington's victory at the Siege of Boston in March of 1776 did suggest that a military solution might be feasible. And that viewpoint had a very strange cheerleader, the ghost of Richard Montgomery. Okay, let me explain. In February 1776, Thomas Paine published a pamphlet where Montgomery rose from the dead and urged a reluctant congressman to break with Britain. Now, if you are asking why Paine chose a reluctant rebel like Montgomery to bear this message, it's because that in death, Montgomery had become America's first military martyr, more patriotic symbol at this point than real person. Congress even paid for an elaborate monument in New York, where his body would later be reinterred in 1818. And even before the war ended, he was the subject of romantic portraits.
Jeez.
Today, 11 counties are named after Montgomery, along with 5 cities, including the capital of Alabama. His glory also rubbed off on others. For instance, Aaron Burr had served under Montgomery during the assault on Quebec and received popular fame because he had attempted, bravely though unsuccessfully, to drag the general's corpse out of the city. He then parlayed that notoriety into an appointment to Washington's staff. Meanwhile, Arnold was still trying to prevent the British counter-invasion. October 11th, 1776, Valcour Island, Lake Champlain. Benedict Arnold, currently carrying the position of Commodore, has the British fleet right where he wants it. Granted, his force was never going to match the Royal Navy. They've shipped prefabricated boats in pieces for the mission, and American shipbuilders cannot match their numbers. Not to mention the British have more ships, more cannons, more trained soldiers and gunners. Arnold's fleet is mostly gunboats with few veteran crew. But he knows the lake, has picked a bay where his fleet remains hidden as the British pass a narrow juncture, and can bait them into attacking him upwind. Cannons roar. Shots arc down on the decks of the crowded ships. An American gunboat runs aground, damaged. a British gunboat explodes, and Arnold's flagship, the Congress, takes 28 hits. They force the British to break contact, but by sunset, most of the American fleet is damaged or sinking. Yet the next morning, when the Royal Navy closes in to finish Arnold, he's already slipped away. They sight the remaining fleet just as Arnold runs it aground and burns it, with the American flag still flying, never striking their colors. In fact, Arnold puts the torch to Congress himself, the last to do so, in full view of the British. Though a defeat, Arnold had slowed the British, preventing Burgoyne from reaching his intended target of Albany before the winter. Though had Burgoyne done so, Washington would have evacuated New York to find another British army at his back and probably would have been crushed. 1776 marked the last time Americans set foot in Canada during the Revolution. Lafayette was put in charge of a new expedition in 1778, but scuttled it, deeming the plan infeasible given the resources available and Carleton's hardening of defenses. During negotiations to end the war, the Americans briefly made a bid to include it as part of the colonies, but the claim was just so absurd, British negotiators scotched it and it was never brought up again. But the war did change Canada. After a peace treaty was signed, 50,000 British loyalists moved from the United States to Quebec province, largely settling in Nova Scotia. Then, frustrated about living in a land of French culture, language, and laws, they began to lobby for Quebec to be split into French and English portions. There was
Get up to $480 back when you bring your phone and keep.
The result was Upper and Lower Canada. Names based on the St. Lawrence River's flow, that's why Upper Canada is on the bottom, relatively, with separate parliaments and legal systems. Within decades, these English settlers had adopted the name of Canadians, which before then had been used exclusively to refer to the French majority. Meanwhile, those now called French Canadians were no closer to becoming mainstream British subjects. In fact, Carleton's heavy-handedness had further alienated them. These moves helped create the genesis of modern Canada and its strained relationship with Quebec. Yet it had special significance to one man, Benedict Arnold. Though he'd received praise for marching across the wilderness, fighting on despite wounds, and holding together a disintegrating army, he had his detractors as well. One political enemy referred to him as, quote, our evil genius, and said he'd led a whole fleet to destruction. Others, officers he quarreled with, tried to have him court-martialed, and those feuds continued in the years after, poisoning his career and hobbling promotions. And as we'll see next week, or right now if you're watching on Nebula, within him, a seed of treason had begun to grow, which, to tie it all together, treachery was something I learned.
Okay, so yeah, now we're all caught up. Wow, so yeah, Arnold... Again, I've said it before, like, you know, I actually started feeling kind of bad for him when I learned a little bit more about him. But, you know, still, apparently he had a lot of a temper and everything. But we'll see in the coming weeks on the next episode with Benedict Arnold, and you'll see it in my next video. And hopefully there's a part 2 as well. So please smash that like button if you want to see more sexy and nerdy content, and subscribe if you think I deserve it. And remember, check out my Patreon for more for full unedited reactions to all my latest videos. And I'll see you on the next episode.